floor and the next floor, right? So you could, it was a real cool bookstore because, you know, it was like a house with books in all the different corners and everything. But if you went down the steps going into the basement, right along the edge of the wall, there was the entire set of the great books. I don't know, about 30 or so books, and they're published in the most boring possible way. You know, 2 columns of small print, and what books did you have? You had Homer, Herodotus, Aristotle, you know, his works, you know, Plato, you know, just all of these folks. And the goal of this project was that students needed to read these books, and then you were an educated person. That was still at you know, the time at the University of Chicago, and in fact the debate with Dewey was with the president of the college, and I'm trying to remember his name. Hutchinson, I think. Hutchinson? Hutchins, not Hutchinson. So the debate between them, Robert Hutchins was the president of the University of Chicago, and he was the one who actually started the printing of the great books in that format. And his argument was that in order to be a graduate of the University of Chicago, you had to know those books. And what Dewey was encouraging was something much more adapted to preparing people to be factory workers, solving problems on the farm, thinking for themselves, so that if a problem came up, that they would be able to figure out a way to solve it, and so on. That very American kind of do-it-yourself attitude, right, requires that kind of ability. So in a sense, I certainly think of that kind of education as more pragmatic oriented, right? John Dewey's theories were very exciting to a lot of people. I remember Tolstoy sent 2 of his friends to America to talk to John Dewey to learn more about it. He also toured, John Dewey toured different places. He went to Europe several times. It was bad for his family, though, because every single time they visited Italy, a son died, got sick and died. I would have thought you'd learn, don't go to Italy, you know, but no, he went 2 or 3 times, and each time they lost a son. Crazy. But they also visited Russia, and what was interesting about a lot of liberals, and he was a liberal at the time, was that they thought highly of the communist project. They thought, wow, that sounds, on paper, this sounds like a new, you know, way, you know, of doing things that's even more forward than capitalism. You know, if you read Marx, he's pretty persuasive. Capitalism is going to cause all kinds of problems. You're going to end up with some people with all the money and everybody else. Can you imagine that ever happening? Oh wait, that has happened. Okay, so Marx was right about that, but still, you get the idea. Communism looked, on paper, it looked pretty good, but every single intellectual that visited Russia to see how things were going were absolutely horrified. Things were horrible, as you can imagine. And so when they came back, they were always, communism, no, forget it, it doesn't work. And Dewey was one of those. He also visited China. China was very interested in the educational program and so on. Now here was the mean thing. While Dewey was visiting China, Hutchins took the activity school program out of the Department of Philosophy and moved it to the Department of Education. Well, that actually makes sense, but on the other hand, that also made sure that John Dewey no longer had charge of what was going on in that activity laboratory school. So when John Dewey got back, he was, of course, upset with the University of Chicago, so he quit and ended up taking a new position at the University of Columbia in New York. And that's where he stayed the rest of his career. I think I have that on my... I lost my... There it is. Where did I have that? Oh, so yeah, University of Chicago, and then 1904 was when he left and worked at Columbia University in New York. I remember he was actually giving a lecture on December 7th, 1941, when they got news of Pearl Harbor. And so in the middle of his speech, he changed and not only announced what he had just heard, but then continued but with a changed speech talking about the necessity of being prepared for war, etc. So another problem for pragmatism is the concept of truth, because truth is what works at the moment. Well, the trouble is, if you follow that theory of the dialectic, the truth is always going to need to be adapted to a future change. And as a result, if you say something is true, our tendency psychologically is to believe, okay, my dad believed this was true, I ought to believe it's true, it's true. It's always going to be true. Well, the problem with pragmatism is truth evolves. And so psychologically, it's bad news to think of something as true. You really shouldn't come to a conclusion and say this is true, because you have to open the door for future change, right? So what John Dewey argued was we shouldn't call things truth or true. What we should instead say is that they are warranted assertions. For the moment, this is a warranted assertion, pending future inquiries, right? Because a future inquiry might teach us that, aha, we thought we understood, but guess what? Now we've got more insight or more data or more incidents where it turned out not to be right, so we can delve deeper and figure out something that might be a better assertion, a better hypothesis that will work for a little bit longer. So you end up with a real interesting problem about whether warranted assertions can be trusted or not, because that's the problem with science. Science famously goes funeral by funeral. Each theory dies and gets buried, and you get a new theory. That theory works really well for a while until, oh no, now we know that's wrong, and so that one gets buried, and you get it. So funeral by funeral, science keeps advancing. Hopefully, although I think I mentioned quite a few classes back Thomas Kuhn and his argument that the structure of scientific revolutions is really more of a human characteristic, and that groups really change the theories that they believe and that works for them, but that's a group that's focused on a particular characteristic or problem. And then the next group that's looking at a different problem might come up with a different theory, and so you end up with what appears to be an advance from, say, a steady state universe to a relativity point of view. And that's, Sir Isaac Newton, Einstein, right? That's one such example that Thomas Kuhn talks about. Copernicus is another one. In fact, Thomas Kuhn wrote a book specifically on Copernicus. But as you do this, what you feel like socially is that we're advancing science. But from Kuhn's perspective, you might not actually be advancing science. You just come up with an alternative explanation that works pretty well in different cases. And you still need the old theory in order to use that for those cases. So you end up with this mind-boggling situation that I tried to introduce at the very beginning, where I asked you, is the Earth going around the sun, or does the sun go around the Earth? And then think about all the other models that we've got, you know, where everything's traveling, you know, in a following the sun, and you've got kind of this entangled, you know, model of all the planets following along and spinning at the same time. But it's definitely not a circular model, etc. So you've got all these different models. I mean, besides that, you have the model that Brian Greene gives us. That's basically a frozen river. Right? All the universe is really permanent, and the illusion of movement is our consciousness. Looking at it like that DVD player, right? That's another model that works in practice in certain contexts. But you wouldn't use that to try to shoot a rocket to Mars, because, of course, why would you do that if you thought, you know, everything was permanent? Oh, wait a minute, that's not really an understanding of the theory, because you still want to do stuff. You still hope to actually reach Mars with your rocket. It's just that, wait a minute, you have to use calculations that'll have to come from what? Some other explanation of how the planets move, etc. It's complex. It's confusing. You know, and there's more theories. In fact, the current understanding I have is that there could be an infinite number of theories, each of which could be practical in a particular context once we come upon it. So, given that kind of view, how do you figure out what's true? You know, you have this gut feeling that something ought to be considered true. By the way, one of the interesting philosophers that I have on my list is C.S. Lewis. And when we were looking at C.S. Lewis, one of the main folks that he was arguing with were the folks in England that were following Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein is going to give us a philosophy of language that adapts to this thesis. And the British took it and started writing textbooks that considered language to be something that evolves, so that the words don't have that OED, right, the Oxford English Dictionary meaning, right? And actually, by the way, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the reasons you need to get a magnifying glass with it is because all the definitions have so much in them that even if you get the one volume version, the print is so small. Why? Because all the words have the definitions that they could gather from all of the different uses from history as well as now. And so you end up with so many different definitions, so many different meanings for each word, that it's actually reflective of this kind of evolutionary idea of the meaning of language, which I think as Americans we've all pretty much accepted this. We could see it. Our language is incredibly dynamic. Article I read by John, I can't think of his name right now, but just the other day, yesterday actually, was on the use of pronouns now for individuals that want to be called they. Right? They're not a he, they're not a she. You wouldn't call them an it. So what do? We say they. Perfect example, I don't know if you've heard of her, is Judith Butler. Judith Butler refers to herself, I screwed that up, sorry. Judith Butler refers to Judith Butler as they, and them, etc. And John, I still can't remember his name, pointed out that all sorts of grammatical problems arise when you're treating a person with the pronoun they, even though it's singular, because they is third person plural, right? So I can't think of John's name. What the heck? I read him all the time too. He's one of those nice, friendly people at the New York Times that emails me once a week. John McWhorter. There we go. John McWhorter. Okay. So warranted assertions. That's how we have to deal with truth. And the theory of inquiry, experience and logic, organic structures. Now, so some of his major works: Psychology in 1887, School and Society 1899. This is boring, isn't it? Should I do this? Democracy and Education. Oh, the School and Society 1899. That was the link that I found online.